From the beginning, when we come into church all exhausted and compromised and fed up and dirty from the week that we've been living, we come and we're not even worthy to worship God. So our first thing is to say, God, take me as I am in all my mess, sort me out so that I can worship you properly. So I've talked before in one of these sessions about how you draw a kind of temperature chart for liturgy, and how there are some things that are fairly flat. Matins is fairly flat like that. A funeral needs to go from a high emotional level slowly down towards the end, so people go out calmly and without having discharged or whatever. Marriages are rather like this; they get bigger and bigger towards the end, and the Eucharist is like this as well. So you need to feel that's going on, and why it's important to know where you are in the Eucharist. And that's why a lot of the services that were developed in the 70s and subsequently had headings in a way that the old Book of Common Prayer and 1928 never did. So it'll tell you, the preparation, the ministry of the word, the peace, the thanksgiving, the breaking, the giving. You'll see all those headlines so as to help you through. They're kind of signposts. (1966). Anybody remember that? The little sort of pale blue book that was around, given out to congregations. This was the second series, Series 2 as it was called. And this was the first real, serious, radical attempt to modernize. At a new direction in liturgical reform, it retained the word thou when addressing God. The priest shares the peace with the people from a long distance away. Nothing happens, he just says it. He just says it. There are shorter words of distribution at the communion instead of, those long sentences that you were used to say in book. So it's now the body of Christ, the blood of Christ, instead of take and eat this in remembrance of Christ, all that. Post-communion prayer was introduced. Almighty God, we thank thee. And it was a new prayer written by a poet, and it talks about a living sacrifice. We are a living sacrifice. The sacrifice that we're talking about is not a lamb on the altar or even just Jesus on the cross. This is about us giving ourselves to God's service as we go about our lives subsequently. Send us out into the world. Go was the big thing at the end of it. And the person who was in charge of all this was still called the priest. But it was a big change, even to be given that when you come into church instead of the Book of Common Prayer was quite revolutionary. And then, that's 1966. 1971, the year I was ordained, the year I came to Westbury-on-Trim. Series 3, the Green Book. Remember that? Remember to see that around? God addressed as you for the first time. A distinct modern typographical style, different with blue rubrics and bold print for the bits the congregation say. The first part of the service is led by a minister, not the priest, and that might be, I don't know, I wasn't a party to the councils at the time, but I guess that might have been because there were women deacons and deaconesses around who couldn't preside, but who were part of the proper ministry team, and a role would needed to be found for them. So we got into, for very good reasons, a rather bad habit in some places of the ministry of the word being conducted by somebody, a deacon or a deaconess, or in many places a lay reader, and then the priest kind of popping out at the offertory, like Punch and Judy to do the second part, which gave it quite disproportionate importance. It shouldn't have been like that. Both parts are equally important. It introduced, we believe in God. So that's a, it's a difficult thing to explain to people because, especially at confirmation classes, when people say, there's quite a lot of things I can subscribe to in the creed, but I don't understand that. And I try gently to say, it's not a list of things that individual Christians are required to understand or believe in. It's a we believe, it's a corporate solidarity thing with the apostolic tradition, that was written in the beginning of the 4th century, the creed. It's in answer to all kinds of things that we're no longer interested in. You know, how many gods are there? We believe in one God. You know, we say it, I'm sorry if this is flippant, but I mean, we say it in the same way that the Labour Party sings the red flag at the Labour Party conference. It's not that they're red socialists, it's just that that's part of their corporate tradition. And we use the creed as something to discuss, to argue about, to say, well, actually, that ceased to be an issue in the year 625. The issues today, if we were to write a creed for now about what we actually do believe, it would have all kinds of other things in, all kinds of things that are contemporary debates in today's world that they hadn't even thought of in the year 325 or whenever that was. So we believe is a kind of corporate thing. What you believe, what I believe, within that is something for debate and argument and discovery and prayer and all the other things that go on. Lay people were allowed to read the prayers of intercession, 1971 for heaven's sake. And the president is now the one who gives the peace to the congregation. He's no longer the priest, nor is he the celebrant. He's the president because he's presiding at something rather like, you know, a host at a meal or the chairman of a meeting. This is something that everybody's doing together. And if you look at the rubrics of any of these services, if you look at the stuff, you can still see it online. If you look at the prefaces to any of these services, you'll see that they all say, Eucharist is done by the whole people of God. It's not what the priest is doing with magic hands on the altar. It's what everyone's doing together, and lots of different people have individual parts to play. You know, there are those who do the readings, there are those who lead the prayers, there are those who light the candles, there are those who make the coffee. The priest, the president, is the one who actually says some of these things on behalf of the people. So that's why, you know, no matter how holy you may be individually, a priest cannot celebrate communion by him or herself. It has to be a corporate action with the whole people of God. And in this new service in Series 3, there was the fourfold nature of the canon, the taking, the thanksgiving, the breaking, the giving. They all had their own headings, and well-trained clergy made that clear in the way that they actually did read the prayer and what they did on the altar. Into the world, send us out into the world, was removed from that last little prayer. It is said by Archbishop Michael Ramsey, because he said in his inimitable way, you know, isn't that suggesting that the church is somehow cut off from the world? Surely when we're in church, we're as much in the world as we are when we're out there. So they listened to him and they said, yeah, okay, we're not stepping from one world into another hostile thing. We're all in the world. We're the same as the people out there, except we happen to be in here. So send us out has stayed in that prayer, but not into the world, as if this is somewhere else. There were more seasonal alternatives, so, you know, more things for Lent and Saints' Days and Advent and Easter and all those things. There were new collects, so we got away from those very old teachery collects. Oh God, thou who art this, that and the other, you know, from the Book of Common Prayer. And a new lectionary, the new three-year international and ecumenical lectionaries were introduced. And the other thing which I didn't put on the slide, but I should have done, was the Series 3 introduced the new version of the Lord's Prayer, Our Father in Heaven, which I don't know who made the decisions in places like this at the time, or since, but, you know, things like trespasses now being talked of as sin, and for a while, do not lead us not into temptation, which has always been a problem, I think, for a lot of people to think about what they're saying, was actually taken back to the original Greek, which was, do not bring us to the time of trial. Again, an echo of what was going on in first century Christianity, where if you were known to be a Christian, you probably would be taken out and tried. And it was a prayer saying, you know, if I am being burnt at the stake, if I am being crucified, if my bits and pieces are being cut off, do not let me fail you, God, in that testing moment. That's a very different thing from lead us not into temptation, which for most Christians was all about having naughty thoughts about the milkman or whatever. That change didn't last, though. It only lasted about less than 10 years before the Church of England, in its radical go-forward kind of mode, decided it liked the old one better. I won't tell you the joke about the light bulbs, but so Series 3 was a big and important change, and then in 1980, the Alternative Service Book, which was, it looked like an old Book of Common Prayer. It has everything in it. It has communion, it has baptisms, funerals, weddings, ordinations, it has all the readings for the year, it has collects for the year, it has all sorts of other things, morning and evening prayer. I mean, it's not very fashionable to say so, but I loved this book. It was really useful. It had everything you wanted in it. It was in modern language. It involved all the good things that had come from Series 3, and it was eminently kind of modern and usable. And it was also the Church of England formally acknowledging that there was and would be a variety of forms of worship in Anglican churches, no longer common prayer. You know, wherever you went in the old days, until 1965, even in Africa, in West Indies, anywhere you went, you'd find people using the Book of Common Prayer. And therefore it was the forms of service that we Anglicans had in common across the world. 1980 was the acknowledgement that those days are gone. Variety is now the order of the day. But they did offer approved versions to try to keep within Anglican doctrinal boundaries. There were two options, Rite A and Rite B. Rite A was the modern version, Rite B was traditional. And in Rite A, for the first time, in 1980, all may exchange the sign of peace, which is when, you know, things started to happen. There were 4 theological Thanksgiving prayers, each theologically different, that could either be used depending on what kind of church you were, where you were on the candle, or seasonally. Some were more penitential, some were more Catholic, some were longer, some were shorter for children and for families and such like. But it did have 1,293 pages. So if you remember using this, I mean, lots of churches had dozens of these in the pews, and people were, you know, the vicar would be saying, now we turn to page 963, and you'd be sort of, and that was clearly thought to be not helpful. And so unfortunately that didn't last, although there were a lot of good things in that book. In the year 2000, that was transformed into common worship, which is what we're now using. And it wasn't a book. It wasn't even a series of booklets. It's a whole library full of stuff. There's one volume on the Eucharist, there's a volume on daily prayer, there's another one on initiation, there's another on pastoral services, there's one for times and seasons. So these days, you'll find clergy got rooms full of liturgy in a way that they haven't had to before. It's all available online, of course, so clergy who like that kind of thing spend almost their entire week in front of their computers designing glorious, beautiful, lovely services for Sunday morning. More inclusive language, more inclusive, not inclusive, you know, they haven't gone right the way through, taken out all the old things about, you know, Lord and mighty and all those kind of things that could also be regarded as non-inclusive, but we don't use he and she for God anymore. So it's, that's the, that's where we've got to now. nearly done, then you can do some talking. To cope with the enormous range of theological and seasonal options now, and to avoid constant change, which we all know we don't like, and unfamiliarity, many churches made their own seasonal versions of these services. So you go into lots of churches and they have, we've got drawers for them. We had to have a whole bookcase built for them. We've got so many at the back here. When you're deciding what goes into a booklet, there are some important theological choices to be made. And when you look at any church's booklets, you see whether those choices were made in an informed and wise way or not. There's a question about, do you put the penitential prayers at the beginning for the reasons I was talking about earlier on, because that's where we are at the beginning of the service, or do you put them after the gospel? So rather like a sort of Billy Graham rally or something, you've heard the gospel proclaimed and you say, yeah, I am a sinner, I want Jesus in my life. This is your opportunity to actually associate yourself. So they both make sense. It makes sense to have them at the beginning. It makes sense to have them in the middle of the service before the peace. So it's your response to what has been proclaimed. Decisions have to be made about the use of Hebrew scripture, the Old Testament and the Psalms. Do you have them all the time? Which bits do you use? How do you use the Psalms? In the days when most Anglicans would go to Matins and Evensong, it didn't matter that you didn't hear the Old Testament in the Eucharist because you heard them ad infinitum. Seems to me there's a very good reason for keeping the Old Testament read in the Eucharist, because it's often the only chance that people hear it being read. And similarly with the Psalms, which go to any spiritual director of your choice, and he or she will always say the Psalms are the place to start. And yet if you don't know the Psalms, if you're not familiar with them, if you don't hear them said or sung, if you never read them, there's a whole chunk of really valuable stuff that is not available. And the thing which most parishes, in my view, don't get right is how you present the fourfold shape of the canon, how you present the taking, the thanksgiving, the breaking and the giving. They should be four equally important things. The taking has got mixed up with the offertory and the collection and the bringing up and down of the bread and wine, which is like the peace, it's become the most ceremonial bit in even non-ceremonial churches. But that's something which, younger clergy who haven't been through this whole thing, they're not, I would say this if Cheryl were here, but they're not trained in the same, they don't come from the same tradition. So a lot of old bad habits have crept back in from the Book of Common Prayer days. Like, if I may say so, and Andre knows I feel this because I bang on about it all the time, why on earth does the congregation here kneel halfway through that? The third bit, the thanksgiving prayer, is no more important, the narrative of what goes on at the Last Supper. That's no more important than what's the other three things. And yet, we stand there for the first bits, then we all, we don't even kneel. People sit down for probably, whatever your posture, stand on your head, swing from the rafters. It doesn't seem to matter what you do, but you do need to do the same thing for those four things, because they're all equally important. But anyway, that's my little beef, which you can talk about later on if you want to. The odd thing about this, in brackets, is that, ironically, in an area of far greater freedom than the Church of England has ever known, these seasonal booklets that churches like to produce actually fix the liturgy, making further development and innovation more difficult. So even after it's happened twice, people will say, oh, but in Advent we always, or in Lent we always, because we have, and we've got it printed in a book. So it's one of those kind of unexpected side effects, really, of the fact that we now have things printed. Who is celebrating is a big theological question, and the answer to that is louder. Everybody. It's not the person behind the altar. Everybody is celebrating together, and that needs to be reflected in the way that we do it. And the other big question is Eucharist as mission. The Eucharist tells the story of the life and death of Jesus, of the glory of the gospel, and it is the most powerful evangelistic tool that we've got. We've really, that should be the thing that we introduce new Christians to as they hear the whole story and are invited to respond. But the Eucharist can become rather the domain of a little private club, and the threshold from out there into what we do on Sunday morning can be too high for some people, which is why maybe one of the reasons why it's difficult to encourage younger families or new people to come here on the 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, simply because it's not familiar to them. And there's no easy answer. I don't know the answer to that. How do you retain what is precious and valuable in the Eucharist without dumbing it down to the point where it becomes valueless to anybody? It might be easy, it might be very accessible and easy and welcoming, but if there is no mystery, if there's no Eucharistic chemistry, if there's no theology left in it, then what are we doing? So some big theological questions to be asking, as well as the little practical things about where the servers stand and all that kind of stuff. I want to stop there. Just for whilst we're sorting out what's going on at the back here, if you're within speaking range, safe speaking range of one or two other people, just have 10 minutes or so on that question. Which parts of the Eucharist do you value most, and why? And saying, "Oh, I like it all," is not an answer. Okay, have a little chew over that one for a minute or two.